Before giving you a floor for questions, to note one thing, if there is something that all these presentations and discussions show, is how different masculinities are positioned vis-a-vis both masculinities, diverse masculinities and femininities, and how much other social relationships of power, be it heterosexuality, heteronormativity, be it ethnicity, be it religion, impact in understanding what being a man means in very, very specific, very concrete context, both time and space defined context.
Looking at evidence from Western Africa, Liberia and Sierra Leone especially, some people have said, also in Sri Lanka, that males which could not have their education and not having their land, the crisis of the youth, both the LTTE and the JVP have been explained in such terms, maybe not very much in a gender-specific analysis, but also relating to a crisis in opportunities or employment. And then I'm thinking, on the other hand, those masculinities in crisis then adopt a way of acting, enactment, as you say, which very often is hugely violent, trying to differentiate from other groups in order to create a new uniform identity, as you say, through those violent acts against others. And I wonder, is this now a different repertoire, a different type of masculinity? And then referring to all those discussions on gender-based violence, and a lot of people say these are continuations of patterns which existed already earlier. These are continuations of violence which are in society itself already, and maybe not only a consequence of this new constructed masculinity. So in a way, I have a little bit of problems. I recognize a lot of your analysis on the one hand, say, okay, that is indeed a formation of a new type of masculinity in response to crisis. On the other hand, it seems also perhaps that all those performances, violent performances which you see, are in a way a continuation of violence which is deeply embedded already in society, and perhaps is simply the hegemonic type of masculinity which is there.
When we're talking about masculinity and femininity, often the tendency is to think about, meaning when we're trying to explain men who experience sexual violence, men who are in the prison and experience torture, always to talk about that in terms of feminization of men. So automatically we think about femininity in terms of less powerful, and masculinity is something which is more powerful. But now we are talking about hyper-masculinity in terms of more powerful within the men. Yet when we are talking about, women like Hillary Clinton and Condoleezza Rice, we don't talk about a hyper-femininity, yet we talk about them operating in a masculine, patriarchal, militarized space. So we discuss this in terms of when we think about feminization of migration, feminization of poverty. Of course, that is another way of thinking about masculinity and femininity. But in terms of conflict, I'd be very interested to hear from the panel how you think about this less powerful position when we are talking about femininity, and automatically thinking masculinity is a bit more powerful, always.
Thank you.
I want to reiterate Vina's point. It's something that was also disturbing me, because in some ways when we talk of masculinity, we don't talk of its other, that is the femininity part. We talk of women's agency, we talk of the threat to men's masculinity and their emasculation as a result of conflict and the ways of negotiation or something. I have a certain occasional discomfort with this. And I was wondering, just as a way of thinking ahead, that is it that we don't talk of women in the same vein because they never had anything to lose anyway? In the sense that, what happens to their in the sessions earlier, we've been talking, okay, women use the same, what should I say, tasks, household tasks, the little things that they're doing, the sort of things that Nadara was talking about for those of you who weren't there in our earlier sessions, that everyday negotiations which they do in their normal life take a different shape and form in times of conflict. And they don't necessarily threaten their femininity. I'm not sure, I'm just asking.
I'm going to add to that question with another. Does it mean that masculinities are produced in a different way than femininities? And I think maybe we kind of now take time to hear some of the reflections from the panelists. Whoever feels like starting, Raymond?
Well, just to link in, it's always struck me that everybody talks about masculinity in crisis, but you never talk about femininity in crisis, right? Sorry. Everybody talks about masculinity in crisis, but nobody ever talks about femininity in crisis, which I think is part of this larger problematic of the way that there's been this attempt to theorize men, and theorize men both in relation, in more complicated ways than feminism historically did, right? Men were always the other, the problem, the patriarchy, all of this. And I think one of the things that happened in the development of sort of men's studies and masculinity studies was that Cornell's work and this hegemonic masculinity, it was, in a sense, it was a shame that was the starting point, because it keeps constructing these sort of fixed models. You know, we're looking for the hegemonic masculine as if there's sort of a fixed model way to be, and then they try and say, well, no, it should be more complicated. There's multiple masculinities, but then there's a sort of dominant one, or maybe there's a couple of dominant, you know, and it gets very, very, very problematic. And I think if actually people talked about women in that way, we'd all say, what are they talking about?
I'm not sure that I exactly agree with Rima, because I think, and this is also an answer, or trying to answer Roshi's point. I think both, you know, we are more comfortable with sort of we can understand the issue of masculinities in crisis, but your question is that nobody talks about femininities in crisis. I disagree. I think people talk about femininities in crisis, but it's not us. If you think of nationalism, the nationalist project is constantly talking about femininity in crisis. If you understand that women are the ones who embody the nation and who have to carry forward the nationalist project, then in our parts of the world at any rate, they're always talking about our dress codes and our sexuality and our behavior, etc. But it's not the feminist project. So I come back to, in a way, my presentation before, which is that while feminist approaches have been, I think, enormously useful, at least let me talk for my work, about looking at some sides of masculinity, there are also ways in which it is closed off, looking at certain other kinds of sides, one of which is how, we never try to assess that hyperfemininity, which is at the other end of the hypermasculinity. We don't even want to go there. So I think it's partly about, it's not about feminist methodology, but it's partly about the feminist political project. So I would say that, in fact, at moments of the social crisis that you talked about, so whether it's arising from conflict or economic crisis or whatever, both masculinities and femininities are up for grabs in terms of, the struggle for, what it really should be.
I think the core for me, in terms of the analysis I tried to portray, is power. I mean, we're talking about closeness or access to power, and we're positioning masculinity and femininity in that regard. And I actually don't think we can talk about power without talking about hierarchies within those. So if we're talking, and this is maybe where I differ with Rima in regard to hegemonic, it's not sitting it as fixed, but one of the ones in dynamic relationship with other kinds of masculinities that structure certain power relations within that. In relation to the question about why masculinity and why femininity, it's actually the privileging. I mean, for me, when I say gender relations, it's the privileging of masculinity within that. And again, going back to power, this is where the analysis starts. So looking at masculinity and femininity, I look at them as context specific. I look at constructions in which femininity and masculinity emerge. And I think part of the work, because they've been absent, right? The focus was on women and on femininity, and looking at the constructions in which these relations emerge, I think the kind of work now that's being done, and in part it's being done when looking at why violence emerges in cases of whether it's rape or sexualized violence, etc. And I think it prompts us to really think deeply and hard about those moments in which these constructions happen, both of femininity and masculinity, and then look at what is it about ethnicity, what is it about religion, what is it about sexuality, what kind of intersectionalities. I don't think we can look at masculinity nor femininity outside of those contexts in which they emerge. And I think the more that thinking takes place, whether it's crisis or no crisis, I mean, crisis, maybe it's part of the context that we need to look at more deeply, but it is this very, very specific, and it varies. I mean, looking at Sri Lanka, and looking at Palestine, and looking at Bangladesh, we might find some commonalities, but the context is very, very different. And the particular constructions of masculinity and femininity in each one of those contexts is different as well. So we have lots of work ahead of us. I think what at least I tried to present is just some questions that emerge in my work that are prompting me to think about them more seriously, because my training, and I think actually for feminists to easily put aside that, and thank you for raising that, as a feminist project and as a project that tries to take these issues seriously, I think it's one that we should not leave behind. It actually, hopefully, will remain at the forefront of the work we do.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. I think what's important, hegemonic masculinity, I think it's very much, of course, an analytical tool. I think for men in a certain society there is one kind of, or at least one kind of masculinity they might want to attain. And I think what's interesting, if you analyze it, that no man whatsoever is able to perform this ideal, typical way of being a man. So to some extent they're all failing. And then it is precisely what you say about intersecting or interlocking identities with other powerful means, material, immaterial, that then are connected, and those are very context specific. So in the Sudan case, it's race and ethnicity, and it's language, and it's being Arab, and that's a construction that has a historical reality. And I think that's very important to understand that hegemonic masculinity as a tool for us clarifies the way that it's to understand how it works. So in answer to your question, masculinity in crisis, it's precisely this problem that I wonder, can you talk about the masculinity in crisis, or is this the condition in which hegemonic masculinities are constructed by continuously using this notion of crisis in order to not allow all men to access hegemonic masculinity? So it's a kind of strategic way of dealing with a kind of access to limited resources.
I agree with you that masculinity and femininity are not at all a fixed content or has a fixed content. It's multiple, contradictory, or what, shifting from one form, one model to another model. But you haven't mentioned that women themselves are playing a critical role in shaping and reshaping masculinity in a certain way, in a certain context. And they struggle, part of their struggle or exercise of agency is to rescue their men from losing their sense of masculinity, which is, I think, what's going on in Gaza now as a conflictual situation. And women, when they're struggling to maintain the masculinity of their men, they, at the same time, struggling to recreate or encounter the crisis of their femininity. It depends. I mean, in order to show themselves as a good woman, they have to maintain their husbands and their men as good men.
I'm very much interested in using the concept of masculinity for gender activism, really in using the concept for practical purposes, less so in terms of academic terms. What I struggle with is the relationship between the production of violence and the construction of masculinity. I really find it interesting to unpack that notion a little bit further. And the question I have is whether the production of violence is actually a product of masculinity, of male identity formation, or whether it's the other way around, that male identity formation produces violence. And I think it's a set of questions around the constituent factors of masculinity that I would like to dig a bit deeper into. And I think the question also, for me, points to the direction of, well, actually the question whether we should unpack masculinity a bit further. It's a very slippery concept. And how does it relate to the sociological notions of structure, agency, identity? And what has masculinity to tell us about those three elements? And the third question is how masculinity as a concept actually relates to men as a social and historical subject, as a category of analysis. One thing is to talk about masculinities, the other is to talk about men in their real life situations. And what is the actual relationship between the two?
I would like to raise a couple of concerns regarding the Darfur crisis. The first one is regarding the timeline for the Darfur crisis. The international community signifies 2003 as the time when the actual crisis erupted. That, to a very large extent, is correct because the comprehensive peace agreement that was signed in 2003 wasn't comprehensive enough to address many of the issues, and as a result, the conflict in Eastern Sudan as well as in Darfur took place. But the actual crisis in Darfur has been going on and off for a very long period of time. Actually, one of the prominent books, which was called The Massacre of Tu'ain, was published in 1978 by Oshari and Bardo, and it refers to an absolute traumatic and violent attacks against Darfuri ethnic groups in that area and its gender implications. So the conflict has really, and the conflicts in plural in the Darfur region, in so many ways associated in the last few years with the international attention and international competition over politicization of the Darfur crisis, which is another bigger issue. The other question is root causes of the conflict, and that again raised a couple of concerns. I think identifying one element as the root cause of the conflict in Sudan raises certain questions, and the conflict has often been constructed as a war of visions: Muslim versus Christians, Arab versus Africans, and in different lines. And while that has been true during the racialization and the exploitation of the Darfurian people in the south by dominant hegemonic regimes in the north and the extreme violence that was directed against them by successive regimes, I think it's a bit more complicated to single one or two intersecting elements as the root cause of the conflict in Darfur and in Sudan. I also am a little bit troubled by identifying that men losing their protector, provider role and identity as one of the root causes for the conflict, because again, it pushes us to at least look at a more kind of deeper and complex understanding of that as well. So these are like broadly two of the issues that I would like to flag.
Thank you.
Yeah. I still think this move to try and understand men and masculinity is profoundly, profoundly important. I still think there's a long way to go in terms of theorizing and fleshing things out. I mean, I'm wrestling with it as I'm using it. At the same time, there's an incredible potential there, and I think there's also an incredible potential there to also reflect back on women, ultimately, in a way, in a much more complicated way than a lot of feminist work has done historically. Matt said something that I think, so now I'm going to accept masculinity in crisis after what she said. Not exactly, but I think one of the differences is that, you know, women have to negotiate crisis and the men in crisis. It's not necessarily the other way around.
This is always the danger of shortcutting, you know, analysis and then, you know, fleshing out only what I thought was important to present here. But I don't think there are root causes, to start there. No conflict has one root cause. So I agree with you. I think if anything can be a root cause, it's the marginal economic, political and, you know, environmental situation that Darfur has been in since it has become part of Sudan. So, I mean, that I think is indeed the case. What I still do think is, talking about a crisis, it becomes increasingly more fuzzy and less, quote unquote, clear how to be a real man. What does it mean to be a real man? And that fuzziness, and I very much agree with your analysis that you see in certain moments that women then become very instrumental in demanding their men to be at least a real man. And that sometimes, and I've done also some studies in South Africa, we see that women actually cheer the men on being violent, and this also happened in Darfur, where you have hakamat, women that sing to the men and cheer them on to be violent in order to vent the honor off, and then you can fill in the family, or it's the lineage, or sometimes it's a... So, but that's per context, that this kind of, what it is to be a man, I think changes.
Just briefly in response to the point, I'm thankful that you raised the idea of the connection between gender activism and masculinity, and I think part of the work or the homework that we all need to engage with is also think of, even if I'm looking at the same context and I'm looking at violence, if we take sexual violence for example, we still need to ask ourselves why certain men who are part of the same group choose or are able not to commit these acts. I mean, and I think if we're looking at, for me, major part of this work is about prevention. It's about change, and this is why the notion of crisis troubles me a bit, or messiness, etc., because it puts us at the scale where is accountability in the system, and how are we to work towards that change? So I just wanted to add that and emphasize that point and bring it into the discussion.
Thank you.
I'll just add to the point, to the comments that you made at the back, that yes, I do agree with you that, you know, masculinity has to be looked at as a social and historical concept, and in some ways, some feminist scholarship has already done that by, say, analyzing patriarchy, the family, you know, different sites where masculinity plays itself out in different ways. But again, to sort of resonate with the rest of the panel, I mean, this work is new and it's necessarily provisional. So we have a platform from which to start off with because of what we know from feminist scholarship. But nevertheless, whether this will produce different answers is to be seen.
And just to usurp the position of the moderator. I want to endorse some points which were made about scholarship. Feminist scholarships has kind of progressed from talking about women to talking about gender to talking about femininity and masculinity, and then to plural, femininities and masculinities. At the same time, we are still struggling somewhere in between being descriptive. Our tools are more describing often what is happening, like men are called women in this and these situations, then having a power to analyze how and why every act of emasculination, or whatever the proper word in English is, demasculinization, becomes feminization. Is the only way not to be one kind of man immediately linked to being a woman? So I think there we still struggle. And I would say that to rethink masculinity, it cannot be done if we don't rethink femininity. And I think also we cannot rethink both of them if we don't take heteronormativity more seriously. With due respect to ethnicity and religion and race, I think that the masculinities and femininities that we talk about would not be the way they are now without heteronormativity. And the way heteronormativity feminizes man, it's so problematic, but we are still, what Rema said, we are still far from having tools to actually address it. We are still struggling to find words which are not just describing what is happening, but actually try to analyze how are certain realities or positions prioritized in this description.
We want to understand men, we want to understand masculinities. And it reminds me a little bit of when I was young, and we were always trained to try and understand men and understand masculinities so that we could learn how to seduce them and trap them and make them marry us. But when you look at the context of armed conflict, seriously now, in a practical way, in a pragmatic way, when we understand men and deconstruct masculinity, is it a pacifist movement? Will we end wars? What is our motivation, our different motivations, plural. And then I also had a thought about Abu Ghraib. You gave me this memory of an American woman who served in the military for many years, who said that what happened at Abu Ghraib didn't happen because those men were Muslim or Arab or brown or black. That's what happens in the American military all the time. That's what we do to each other. And it was such a disruptive, thought, and I've always thought about it. So that it's normal for military American men, especially when they're younger and newly recruited, to be raped or to be mock raped. It's part of the disciplining and the initiation. And again, I thought of British boarding schools, in Kenya, in the UK, in South Africa, American universities and fraternities and hazing rituals. What the images we saw in Abu Ghraib would be seen in those dormitories, as men fraternize and initiate new men. And again, it also made me think, in that case, when women join the military and they're given the pill because you're going to be raped, you better get on the pill, by the very kind, knowing military nurse. Is it really because they're women, or because part of military culture, military initiation includes sexual domination?
The question in regard to hazing, definitely there is a connection, but I think it is important to take the context into account, because in one of the quotes I didn't read, one of the assessment reports in the investigation in regard to what happened, the psychological assessment reports in regard to what happened in Abu Ghraib, I'm just going to read it very briefly. It says, this is according to a military dog handler. He said, even dogs came not to like Iraqi detainees. They, the dogs, did not like the Iraqi culture, smell, sound, skin tone, hair color, or anything about them. So notions of difference, representation of the other feed into, because you need an enemy, and whether that enemy is within. And this is why in the US there is the don't ask, don't tell policy, which is the greatest illustration of how homophobia, functions together with masculinity and militarization to sustain a certain. The other point that I'd like to emphasize actually is how important it is to also recognize, I mean, I don't think we can generalize, and I actually disagree with you to say every woman gets a pill, etc. That's a generalization. There is violence against women in the military, and it's being contested and addressed, and it's a reflection of that dominant structure that tells women your place is not here, and if you're here, you have to act only in a certain way or within, or we'll put you in your place. But I think what is important in this context is to also understand the kind of contestations internally that take place and how the military itself adjusts. I mean, the use of femininity, if you look at, and I spoke about this yesterday in our presentation, who are the spokeswomen now? Victoria Clark was the spokesperson for the US military during the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Miri Isim was this. These are women, so the use of femininity, use of motherhood, used even of women within the military itself, because of recruitment issues, so there is a contestation, and we can't ignore that, and I think it actually testifies to that contested and relational relation, and also how dominance, if we're talking about power, we have to take the two into account and understand the structure and context in which they emerge. So I just wanted to add that.